My name is Austin Knight. I'm a senior UX designer at HubSpot. Show of hands, how many of you all have heard of HubSpot before? Maybe you've used our products. Okay, so for the few people that aren't familiar with us, we're a software as a service company based out of Boston, Massachusetts, and we produce all-in-one software that helps businesses to run all of their marketing and all of their sales out of one place. As a senior UX designer at HubSpot, I do a few different things, but primarily I oversee the user experience design for HubSpot.com and all of our primary web properties. So these are some pretty big sites. They receive around 10 million hits per month, and our processes for how we design for them, how we iterate on them, are pretty intricate. Because of my role there, I've gotten to experience a lot of different types of design reviews with designers and devs alike. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today, because I've observed some things that I think can help design reviews go really well, but they're not being discussed all that often. So I want to talk about deflecting bullshit, or in other words, how to defend your work against terrible feedback. I'm going to speak about this from a designer's perspective because that's what I know best, but the idea is that this can apply to devs, marketers, project managers. How many of you all are designers in this room? Okay, so a good portion. What about developers? Okay, so obviously the overwhelming majority. The intricacies may be a little bit different, but this should apply to you as well. So this all started with a talk that I was giving in Budapest about the importance of humility in design and why I believe that humility is the most important quality that a designer can possess. And one of the audience members asked me, he said, okay, I'm completely on board with all of this humble stuff, but when I need to defend my work, when push comes to shove and I need to make sure that my design gets brought through, how can I stay humble and open-minded in doing that? And it's true, they're kind of at odds with each other, because if you need to stand up for your work, it's hard to still appear like you're being open-minded and humble. And so I thought for a little bit, and I was like, you know, this actually reminds me of a creative director that I once knew, or more specifically, the worst creative director that I ever had the pleasure of working with. Now, I'm not going to name names or tell you anything specific about what he did, because that would be completely irrelevant to this talk and also unprofessional. But what I can tell you about is the specific approach that he took to design reviews and feedback, the areas where I saw issues, and what I learned as a result of that. So there were several issues or specific approaches that he took with his design reviews. The first was probably the most important, which was that he just ignored feedback in general. So if you gave him a piece of feedback about a design, it would either be met with some form of a dismissing comment, where he would kind of derail the conversation a little bit, or he would say, oh yeah, okay, I'll update that, and then you would check in at the next stand-up and you'd realize that nothing changed. He'd belittle junior designers. So if a designer was less qualified than him on paper, he would make sure that they knew that at all times of the day. And what that did is that set him up to always have the superior design in reviews, because he was the highest ranking individual in the design org. So nobody would ever question his work because he was the most qualified. He would speak in riddles. He'd use terms like rudder and FPO, things that most designers wouldn't even know. Definitely a lot of the stakeholders, like our marketers and developers, would have no idea what he was talking about, but we would go along with it because it sounded smart. He would trash work that wasn't his. It could have been a great design, but if he didn't come up with it, he'd make sure that he found a way to disagree with it and put it down. And then if you really, really got close to him and you backed him into a corner, he'd start up bringing his Cannes Lions Awards, which we know is the greatest qualification that a designer could ever possess, is whether or not they win awards. That's sarcasm. Awards mean nothing. These are all essentially lazy tactics at grabbing power, right? He was trying to gain power over the junior designers, trying to gain power over the marketers so that he could push his ideas through and have something better to put in his portfolio. Now, when we view it in this sense, this is actually something that the design community hates. We hate these ideas of people doing political things in meetings just to gain power. Yet we seem to encourage it in our community at every opportunity that we can get. These are headlines from well-respected, great publications in the design community. Winning a user experience debate. It doesn't matter if you're right or wrong, this is how you're going to win. Getting to yes, presenting and defending design. This is how you get somebody to say yes, even if they shouldn't. How to convince the client that your design is perfect, even if it's total shit. One agency went so far as to mock the feedback that their clients were giving them, basically making it seem like it was very elementary and stupid. That was a well-respected agency out of France. And then if you looked at how this article was being shared and what people were saying, the design community was encouraging this. We were sharing in each other's misery. We even see this pattern in the title of this very talk, Deflecting Bullshit, How to Defend Your Work Against Terrible Feedback. You know what I think about this title? I think this title is bullshit. And I think that these perspectives are bullshit. I would like to propose a different approach, which is that instead of defending our work, we stop defending it at all. We stop taking this terrible approach to design reviews. Now, I know that this is a little bit of a scary concept. I was a young designer once. This is what I imagine I looked like. And when I was getting ready to go into a design review, I would get scared. I would fear the criticism that was going to be brought up about my work. I would anticipate the feedback that I was going to get as a result of that fear. And then I would prepare some canned responses that I could throw out at people so that I could ultimately defend my work, because that's what any good designer does, is they get the design through. They get it shipped, they get the client to approve it, they get the creative director to sign off on it. So I was doing what I needed to do in order to get my design approved. But then I grew up and I became a senior designer, which we know that senior is, that's all that you need is a title, and then all of a sudden everything changes about you. And I stopped fearing criticism and I started listening to what people were actually saying in the room. I started reflecting on what was being said by them. And instead of preparing canned responses, I actually inquired as to what they were saying. What do you mean by that? What does this person actually care about? You could say I stopped defending my work. I was a little bit more confident in what I was creating, and I was open to criticism. In a way, I started taking my own advice and actually trying to understand my audience, which maybe this is a little counterintuitive, but in user-centered design, your audience isn't just your users, it's also your stakeholders, and we tend to forget that. But these people that we go into design reviews with, we're also designing for them, not just for our users. So I would like to propose that rather than defend their work, designers should listen, reflect, and ask questions. Don't get defensive. Get curious. So, I want to start with the inherent problems that come with trying to defend your work, because regardless of the nuances, if you go into a design review and you're ready to start standing up for your work and defending it, you're going to have some problems, and I want to identify those. The first and most basic way to put this is that it's just tough to run a productive review from the defensive because it puts two sides of the room at odds with each other. But you also have to commit 3 inconvenient actions whenever you want to defend your work. The first of which is that you're going to have to make a call on legitimacy without even knowing if you're ready to do that. So you immediately have to say, okay, this feedback that this person is giving me is illegitimate, it's stupid, I disagree with it, and then you have to start defending your position. A lot of the time, the feedback that you're getting is actually perfectly legitimate, and you're shutting it down too early. You risk not understanding deeper what the stakeholder is trying to tell you, what their feedback is, and you actually end up jeopardizing the rapport and empathy that you would build with your team by working more with them. And then you throw away collaboration. So when you're defending a point of view, 50% of the people are going to be defending one side, the other 50% are defending another. They come at each other and they cancel each other out, and you walk out of the room having accomplished nothing. So you end up wasting a bunch of resources that you could have used and put toward better collaboration, building better rapport with your team, and actually taking into account the feedback that was given to you. But this ability to listen to your stakeholders and acknowledge their feedback, it's actually not just the quality of a good designer, it's just the quality of a good leader. And this is where this concept kind of transcends design. Good leaders, good marketers, good developers, good designers, they're open to feedback and they're able to listen to what their stakeholders have to say and translate it into action. So despite being celebrated in design, I would argue that it is wholly unproductive to respond defensively to criticism. I don't think that's a particularly controversial point of view, but when you put it into the context of design, for some reason it is. So let's dive into that. What's a different approach that we could take? I think that there are a lot of options that you have here for how you can run a better design review. People have written books on this. I think it's actually much simpler than that, something that we can cover here in the next 5 or 10 minutes, because the answer has been sitting in front of us all along. We've always been practicing user-centered design, but we haven't been practicing user-centered design reviews. So I would say if we can take those principles and apply them to the reviews, we're already going to be in a better place. The best design reviews that I have participated in were essentially run like a user test, where the designer and the stakeholder sat down together. The stakeholder talked about the design, what their goals were, what they felt they could or couldn't accomplish, and the designer actually wrote that stuff down and used it and put it into action like they would feedback from a user test. But when we start defending design, it starts to feel a little bit more like a battle toward the death of one design versus another concept, and we get away from this collaboration that we would want to see in design reviews, where ultimately we're working together for a better solution that's going to work for our stakeholders and for our users. There's 3 key things that we have to do in order to run a user-centered design review. The first of which is that we have to place a focus on collaboration, we have to listen, and then we have to be open to questioning people and receiving questions. So let's start with collaboration. If a stakeholder criticizes a design, the designer should work with them in order to arrive at a better solution together. When a stakeholder offers critique, they should expect a follow-up question to their criticism, and they should be willing to work with the designer toward a better solution. The key dependency here is that the stakeholders need to maintain an open mind and properly qualify their feedback with data or reasoning, because you can't always get good data on this stuff, so that they can build empathy and trust with their team. It's really tough to collaborate with a stakeholder that doesn't understand or respect design. So they've got to hold up their end of the bargain, but your side is that you have to be willing to collaborate with them and actually work toward a better solution with them. When we think about listening, it's in the same way that user tests are recorded with a lot of detail and we put the feedback down and we put it into the design, we should do the same thing with our design reviews and document this stuff and use it to drive the decisions that we're making. This is doubly true if we have some form of quantitative data or appeal to business goals in the feedback that we're receiving. By listening to and recording this feedback, we can build empathy and trust with the teams that we're working with, which is important. Key dependency here, this is really hard to get organizations to buy into, but it's the only way that I've really found to get this to work, which is that the designer needs to be empowered to make the final call on design decisions. And oftentimes, they aren't that person. But if we think about this from a little bit more of a global perspective, they're actually going to be the best position to determine what needs to happen with the design. They're going to be taking in qualitative feedback from user tests, quantitative data from the product itself, and then now if they're taking this approach, they should have a pretty good pulse on what many different stakeholders across the organization care about and what they need in the product. The most important part of this is that when they're empowered to make the final call on the designs, they no longer feel threatened in a design review. That's a lot of the reason why we defend our work, is because we're afraid, okay, if I don't stand up for this, then the VP who's making the final call, or the tech lead who's making the final call, is not going to hear my argument. They're going to think that my design is terrible, even though I know it's the right thing, and they're not going to approve it. When it's the designer that's ultimately making the decision, they're no longer put into that inconvenient position where they feel like they have to constantly defend their point of view, and instead they can take in the feedback and rest assured that they're going to make the decision that's best for the product, for the user, and for the stakeholders. And then finally, with inquiry, we should always default to asking questions rather than pushing people away. The goal here is, more than anything, to challenge the feedback that we're being given so that we can dig deeper into what the stakeholder actually wants, or confirm that the feedback actually isn't well-founded and it's something that we should move on from. So as a result of this, stakeholders are going to have to expect to get a lot of questions and be able to provide their reasoning and back up their thoughts. This can't be seen as an indictment of the feedback that they're being given, but rather as a critical part of the design review process. So you can't get offended when somebody starts asking you a bunch of questions about your feedback. They're not attacking you, it's just that they're trying to understand. If we do these three things, we're going to see some new outcomes. The first and most important of which is that now the designer should not be able to just understand what is being critiqued, but why it's being critiqued in the first place, what the stakeholders' motivations are, what they care about. The second is that when we break out our categories of legitimate and illegitimate feedback, we see two distinct outcomes. If we're dealing with legitimate feedback, so feedback that is actually well-founded, something that we should pay attention to, we'll find that when we show genuine care, when we work toward an improved solution and we ask these questions, we're ultimately going to result in a better design. And if we wouldn't have done that, we would have missed out on the opportunity to improve the design. But perhaps more importantly, when we have illegitimate feedback, we're going to be able to uncover the weaknesses in that feedback without ever having to actually defend our work or confront the stakeholder. It's going to manifest itself naturally. So to give you a little bit more of a concrete example, that creative director that I was talking about earlier, I would go into design reviews with him when we first hired him, and I would present my design, and he would do the classic thing where he would, say that something was wrong with it, speaking in these jargon terms. I wouldn't quite understand him. I would try to understand, but I wasn't getting it. And he would catch me off guard a lot of the time, where I would almost be like kind of speechless. Like, I couldn't even really come back at him because I didn't even completely understand what he was saying to me. So I would take this feedback and I would go back to my desk and I'd be like, okay, he said that these are the things that we need to improve about it. And I would try to work on it, and I wouldn't be able to come up with anything because I still didn't understand it. So then I started getting to a point where I was like, okay, I need to really, really dig deep with this guy and figure out what he's trying to get at here, because I'm just not getting it. And I started asking questions. I started really listening. And instead of, when he was speaking, trying to formulate a response, I was just listening to what he was saying and then asking the next most natural, genuine question. And this sort of naturally evolved into this space where I realized that his feedback was actually operated by an ulterior motive, whether it be for political gain or because he wanted to push his design over mine. That was what came out through the questioning. And the interesting thing was that as I continued to question him, his feedback would fall apart. Usually after 2 to 3 questions, he would himself admit that he was wrong in his feedback and that we should keep the design direction that we had, because it wasn't well-founded. There wasn't actually anything backing it up, right? So we're able to identify the illegitimate feedback when we push the stakeholder and get to the bottom of what they're actually trying to say. So I would propose that the best way to defend work is actually to not defend it at all. The design is either going to naturally defend itself because it's a good design and you're going to be able to find that the feedback isn't well-founded, or you're going to welcome the opportunity for new feedback and change your perspective on the performance of the design in the first place. You won't have to compromise on any of these 3 things. You'll still be able to make the right call on legitimacy, understand your stakeholders and collaborate with them, while making sure that the design goes to the right place. Don't get defensive, get curious. HubSpot's information is on the left. My information is on the right. This short link at the bottom here popped up several times. That'll take you to a guide that I've created with a bunch of tools, resources that kind of dive into this perspective. This talk was also, as a little bit of an experiment, recorded in virtual reality with this little camera right here. I just released a VR site. If you would like to rewatch this talk in VR and see how different it is, it'll be up there in a couple days.